This is the title of my book, You Make Your Path by Walking. It's like the movement is really, really important. Literally the movement. Now, that doesn't mean you're always moving, but it means you're on a journey that is unfolding and you need to be tuning to what's the right next step for me.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. On today's podcast, I am talking to Suzanne Anderson. Suzanne is the founder of the Mysterial Woman. She is a psychologist, an author, coach, leadership consultant, and a transformational teacher. Her most recent book is titled You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss. Because she did... I say most recent because you were part of you were a co-author of another book, Suzanne. What was that?
I was.
What was that
Yeah.
book?
Well, that book was my first book, called The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. And that was based on really 10 years of leadership consulting and research that we did in our university programs for women, trying to find or understand, let's say, more about what it meant for women to awaken to a way of leading that was outside of just the masculine or kind of hyper-masculine model. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, welcome again, and thank you for explaining
Thank you.
that. I am honored to have you on the podcast. Now, where are you joining us from today? Where are you?
I'm in
You're sitting in your
Seattle.
home in Seattle.
This is actually my studio, which
Okay.
is behind my actual house. I have a little studio where I work and see clients and do my online programs. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I lived in Seattle. It's one of the first places I lived when I moved to the U.S. was in the Seattle area for almost a year.
Oh, really? Wow.
I lived in Bellevue and Redmond area. I had host family, so I am very familiar. Well, I'd say, yeah, I have a very strong tie to Seattle. My sister's actually buried in Seattle, so
Really?
at Evergreen Cemetery outside of Seattle.
Ah.
So, yeah, so I have
How many years ago was
that
that
bond there.
that you were out here?
She died in 1990. My sister died in 1996. And I lived there 1994 to 95. And she was there in a dance. So same kind of dynamics, but that's a whole other
Right.
thing. But I do have
sounds like it probably
I have
is.
a whole strong spiritual connection to that area. Well, Suzanne, share with us the book. You wrote this book. There is, of course, a lot of background of why it is you wrote this new book.
Right.
And it has to do with you losing your life partner, David, who died by suicide. And we can share a little bit about how this book came to be.
Yeah. Well, let's see. That is
A big question. How about this?
Yeah.
Share with us this very beautiful bond. And again, I don't want you to share too much that then people are like, oh, I already got the cliff notes of the book. Why even read it? I want them to actually be still intrigued to go and read it because there's so much in it. So share your relationship with David and that really strong bond you guys had and how you met.
Yeah. So I do feel that my whole life was sort of finding its way toward David in a strange kind of way. I had this sense when I was a little girl of a David. I don't know where it came from. I don't know. Was it a TV thing? Was it? I don't know. But I just sort of, every time I would meet a David, I would wonder if he was the one. And ultimately I ended up marrying a Robert, and who was not a David. And
But I remember, but you said, but his dad's name was a David, right? So you're like, oh,
yeah,
that's close enough.
that was right. And I thought, okay, that must be it, because it was just this strange little thing. And ultimately, I lived on an island. My life took me all over the place, but I ended up with my first husband living on an island near Seattle. We were in the breakdown of our marriage. Actually, it I think probably fell apart in the stress of trying to get pregnant and have children or have a child, which did not happen. Had many miscarriages, but did not actually result in pregnancy. But that is super stressful on anybody's relationship, of course, and ours did not make it through that challenge. So my meeting with David was, I'd actually heard of him and his store in Seattle, which was a well-known, kind of iconic Indonesian antique furniture store. 14,000 square feet in this fabulous historic building. And you would just go in there and it would smell like vetiver and on the sort of scents of Indonesia. It was just beautiful. And my sister lived in Indonesia. So when they visited, I'd taken her in there, and I think I even knew that he lived on Vashon, which is where I lived. But one day I went to a concert, that his home was about 5 minutes away from mine, and he had done incredible things of bringing antique Indonesian homes from Java. He would take them down, dismantle them one little piece of wood at a time, rebuild them in his workshop in Indonesia, put them all back up, number them all like Lego, and then ship them over in containers. It was just insane, along with Indonesian carpenters that he would bring over, and they would then put everything back up again. So he had this incredible temple building made out of teak, gorgeous, from an area of Indonesia called Kudus. And there was a concert, Indian music concert going on, and I'd wandered up there to watch it. And I saw this interesting man. I was still married at the time, wasn't looking for a relationship. I actually thought that Robert and I would work it out, would get through this hard part. Anyway, I asked somebody whose place was it, and I think I probably knew it was David's, but who was David? And they pointed him out, and yeah, I took him in as a very elegant, handsome, interesting man. But the person I was asking said, "I think he's gay," and I thought, okay, well, that's fine. But I didn't. That just sort of went in because he didn't live with anybody. He had this incredible, eccentric life, and there was an assumption made. So ultimately, I won't tell the whole story of how we met exactly. That the reader can get in the book, because it is kind of a high speed chase in cars. But when we did meet, I had the sense that he was gay, so I felt a freedom to talk about my new impending divorce. And he thought all the times I'm talking about being divorced was because I was coming on to him. So
You're
it was
like, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. While you were
that's what he thought.
thinking more, oh, I'm free to talk to him because he's not a threat to my
He's not going to hit
to
on
my
me, and it's going to be all right. And which meant that we had months of developing this wonderful friendship, actually, which was beautiful. And then we had that as a foundation when things did kind of turn toward a more intimate relationship. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It gives such a beautiful description to who he was and his energy, and just like you said, eccentric. Well, just the fact of bringing these artifacts like from beyond and building his land was where you guys lived was big, right? How many acres? Like 17
15,
acres, something like
15.
that.
Well, 15 when I moved in, and then I bought 5, so it was 17 altogether.
17. Okay.
Yeah.
17 acres in total
Yeah. I guess I
of
bought 3.
land, and you had different little structures on the property of different spaces where you would go. Now, I'm going to backtrack a little because
Mm.
you've been in this space of transformational space for many years prior
Mhm.
to meeting David. So, tell us that journey of how you became a transformational coach. With that, is that the right wording?
I guess so, in a certain sense. I was in the leadership space and working as a management consultant for many years, and based ultimately from Toronto. Initially, my consulting firm was in Toronto, and then I moved to France, to Paris, to run the international office of that work. And at the time, this was the 90s, it was a big time for leadership development. Basically, organizations having to come out of this more masculine model into sharing information, using other ways of knowing, team building, all that kind of stuff. And it was a very exciting time for me. There weren't very many women in that space, working with senior teams, and it was very exciting. At the same time, the few women that were in senior levels of organizations were suffering, and I would be with them in these executive offsites that we did, and it was almost like they were stuck inside of what I would call now a masculine model of leadership, and they'd learned to be very good. They'd learned to be one of the boys, and I thought they'd be so excited to meet me as a woman consultant, because there weren't that many, as I said. And in fact, they were the most resistant to the change. It was sort of
Mm,
stunning to me. But at the same time,
interesting.
late at night in the bar after our sessions, they'd say, they'd tell me about what was really going on for them and their suffering. So that it was like something was really wrong here. Something was fundamentally wrong. That we were in this great wave of leadership development. A lot companies were now investing a lot in that, but women seem to be slotted in that wave to be developing along the same lines as men. And was that correct? I wasn't sure, but I needed to find out. So I actually ended up leaving the firm and setting up a private coaching practice. And it was full in a minute with
This
women
is in what
who
year? What year
this
is this? In the
would
late
have been,
90s?
the mid 90s, mid 90s.
Mid 90s? Okay.
Yeah. And because the late 90s, I'd moved here. So to here being Seattle. And what I discovered was over the course of a year of working with women was that I was in territory that I wasn't sure I was exactly equipped for. I mean, I sometimes felt literally like I was one step ahead of the women. I knew there was a problem, and it wasn't just about behaviors. It wasn't just about teaching new skills. It had to do with something under the surface, which I later came to understand would be more what I would call now developmental trauma. And so ways that we learned to get love, safety, and belonging by putting parts of ourselves away
Away.
into the shadows. But I didn't know that then. I just knew there was something that I didn't know. So I went back to graduate school in developmental psychology in women, focused on women in particular, to seek to understand that. Um, so that was and then that work was just phenomenal. I mean, it continues to be. It was like this, and it's probably worth saying it rose together with a spiritual awakening I'd had with the divine feminine in Indonesia. And that sense of there's something trying to happen on the planet right now around the awakening of the feminine. I was in a very mainstream world, of a more masculine world in my work, and I didn't really understand what even the divine feminine or deep feminine was. And the 10 years I spent doing my programs were the research to figure that out. So that was learning about transformation and trauma and how do people change. And so when we got to this moment that we're going to be speaking about,
Yes.
I had a lot of understanding. I mean, certainly academic, or let's say, I understood things about trauma and transformation, and I'd had my own lived experience at some level, but this was, of course, another thing altogether. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's different when you've already been in a space and then you experience it yourself. There must be this sense of responsibility, like, wait, but I already know intellectually what I'm supposed to be doing and how I'm supposed to be dealing with this. But it's very different when you're actually living it. And so when you experience David's death, it's 2013.
Mhm.
So correct?
Mhm.
So January 2013. So it's been 10 years since
Yes.
his death. And in that time period, you had been together already 10 years at that
We were
moment?
together 10 years, yeah.
10 years. You experienced his death. You did not see it coming. It was just out of left field. And there's these little nuances around it that gave you then an idea after his death that he had been thinking about it, which were the letters that he wrote and left behind. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, so I'll come back and tie it all together. Tell us that moment then after his death. You're reading this letter. How was it for you reading that?
Yes, well, I think I should say that he had left letters, 5 letters, for different people close in his life, and I was one of them, in a brown paper bag in his car, which was so un-David. He was a very elegant, as I mentioned, and, beauty was everything for him, that he didn't have a beauty, but I think it was because he didn't want it to be found when I first got back. I'm not exactly sure, but the police got the letters before I did. So because it was basically, in essence, a crime scene, they took them, which was horrible. So I had this sense of David had written something, but I couldn't get it. I couldn't have access to it. And of course, I was absolutely in shock. There were no indications that this was coming. The night before, we'd been at the dinner at his sister's house for celebrating a wedding that was coming up on Saturday. This was Wednesday night, and of
Uh,
his niece.
Claire and Chris? Yeah, Claire and
Yeah,
Chris.
yeah, great. And they met through him because it was his niece and the son of his best friend in Indonesia who had helped him start his furniture business. And they were getting married on Saturday. So we'd had this incredible dinner. He was making toasts and was just the life of the party. He was struggling with tinnitus. This is something to say, which is this terrible screeching in the head of sound, which I've heard is absolutely brutal. And because there is no cure for it right now. Many people do consider, can I live with this? Can I actually go on? And he'd had it for about 3 months, so that was a definitely a factor for him. Of course, there was much more going on than just that. So I wanted to understand what had happened, what was going on. Like somehow I have to understand this. And I was just waiting to get the letter. So it wasn't until the next day that I got the letters, and then I got my own, and then there were others I had to deliver to the others. And that was very difficult. I actually had a good friend of mine sit with me because I wasn't sure how I would take in whatever it was. And just letting those words land in me, which were letters by those who leave by suicide, can be very problematic. So, I will say I I'm grateful for the fact that he wrote me a letter, and it was very loving, and it helped me understand that he just couldn't go on. He just had no strength to go on.
Something that when you mentioned some briefly what something he said in the letter regarding you've been to, what is it, the Hades, and that something about in the word, sorry, I'm like trying
No,
to
that was you're thinking of.
recollect that.
I think you're
That was
thinking
not
of.
from that letter. Okay, tell me
No,
that part because it says something. You've been
yeah,
already to the bottom. You're going to be
right.
able to
No, that
move
certainly
forward.
was
Tell me
not
that one.
David. That was not
It
David.
was not that.
That was
Oh, okay, okay.
one of that's something that happened. Why you're confusing them is just because I do read the letter to this friend, Michael Mead,
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
who is an author and also does a lot of work with ritual and helps people through suicide. I mean, had been working at the local high school where there'd recently been a suicide. And he is a mythologist and a ritual elder, as I say. I asked him to come and meet me the next day, just like help me understand what had happened. And I read him the letter. Now, prior to that, just to say, I work also with myth, and myth is a very powerful myths that endure over time. It's like they
Yeah,
have
and you
the
start each chapter with one of these myths, so it's really you tie
well,
it
I
into
wrote
your
I
life
wrote
with
my
some of these.
own little
Beautiful.
myth, but the myth that has been a central myth in my own work with women for years and still for me now is the Persephone Demeter myth. And that is the myth of this young maiden. Do you know that myth from Greek? A Greek myth?
Oh my gosh, I have not read Greek
Yeah,
mythology, and woo!
100
But
years.
go
Yeah.
ahead, but tell me.
Well, the basic essence of it is, and is that Persephone is this innocent maiden picking flowers in a field, and with her mother, Demeter, and Hades, who's the god of the underworld, has seen her, fallen in love with her, and decides he will have her as his bride. And he agrees or arranges it with Zeus. And
Mhm.
one day he comes up on his chariot, the horses thundering, and grabs her and takes her down into the underworld. And there are many things that happen in this myth that are very interesting that I won't go into depth here, although in my first book I do go into the myth more. Um, and the interesting thing that happens next for Persephone is that she resists that she's in Hades. She won't eat anything, she won't talk. She's just like, I am not here. This is not happening to me. And then at a certain point, she is going to be set free. Zeus agrees she has to leave now. And Hermes, the messenger god, comes to get her. And as she's about to return to the upper world, Hades offers her a few pomegranate seeds, which she chooses to eat. And thinking, okay, I'm getting out of Hades. I can eat these now. And then she goes to the upper world. And then she meets her mother again and realizes very quickly that because she's eaten the fruit of the underworld, she must go 6 months into the underworld and 6 months to the upper world.
Oh, she made a commitment.
Well, what happens ultimately is she becomes queen of the underworld, falls in love with Hades, is the queen of the underworld and queen of the upper world. And the reason I use the myth in my programs and why it was important now, and we'll return to this story, is that we as women have often neglected our embodied experience, which we could call
Mhm.
the underworld, or that which is not conscious, rational, logical, and the body. And we need to have a relationship with it in a yin and yang symbol. The yin is the dark in that yin yang symbol. And our tendency is to resist what happens. And we don't need to resist. And so that is the main thing, that I do in my work. So Michael said to me, and I read him the letter, and I was struggling with what to make sense of this. And he just looked at me and said, remember, you are Queen Persephone. And this situation, this tragic situation, is going to drag you into the dark at a deeper level than you've ever been before. But you do know how to navigate in the dark, and you can trust that. And you need to do that. That's where you need to go now. Don't resist. We'll hold space for you in the upper world, and let go now. And something in that moment, something did shift in me, almost like a kind of surrender, a kind of surrender um,
To the grief.
to everything that the dark would take
Mm.
me into, because it was grief, anger, fear, terror, really. Um,
Mhm.
and it was everything.
Yeah, and there was so many some answered questions after he died regarding the reasons. A lot of it had to do with this financial responsibility as well that now you were going to have to figure out as well. So
That's right.
that in itself, that is very heavy too. That brings you,
Hmm.
down as well. So how I wanted to then tie these two aspects, then you are now this woman who's empowered other women. You've done all these. You're now dealing with your own situation. You were about to have a retreat.
Well, the two things that were right, the two things that were going to happen. One was my first book was about, it was finished, and it was, here it is. I'll just, that's my first book, The Way of the Mysterial
Okay,
Woman.
so okay, I
Yeah.
see it now. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So that was it was complete, was ready to find a publisher and come out in the world. And we were running that aligned with that because my co-author and I had taken some time out of running programs to write. We were about to run our first program 5 days later after David's death. So all of a sudden, the directionality, just to imagine it, I'm ready to fly. Literally, it felt like I'd spent years of figuring this things out
Wow.
in the research, and we're about to go out into the world with it. And life said, no, you'll take one more deep dive, and you'll really live this and
Yeah.
see if it's true, if this operating system, we could say, this inner operating system, this way of being and doing in the world can really hold up in the most
Mm.
unimaginable circumstances possible, basically.
Wow. Yeah, the again, there the yin and yang of what you were experiencing in your own life, these contrasts of things going on, of your life about to take off in one direction, yet you're
Exactly.
being pulled back down again to the underworld again. L- let's talk about rituals and how rituals were part of your grief journey and your grieving journey.
Mm,
Take us into the first ritual you did after David's death, please.
yeah. Well, ritual, first of all, this is, I think it's worth saying, it is a language that I teach in the work that I do. I think it's a forgotten language, not by Indigenous people, of course, but in our Western world. We do know the value of rituals, celebratory rituals like weddings, and we do know the value of a memorial, but we've lost a lot of other rituals. And what ritual does, and we know this, there's just been so much good work done in this field over the years, but ritual speaks to the conscious and the unconscious. That's what happens. It speaks to the body. And when you're in a trauma situation or any loss, doesn't have to be as dramatic as, let's say, what I went through, you need to speak to both parts of yourself. I often think of the iceberg theory as a way of describing consciousness. It's a well used kind of metaphor where 2/3 of our consciousness is under the surface of awareness, and yet it determines the direction of where we move, the choices we make in life. So we need to speak to that part of ourselves, and ritual does that. And I knew that for myself from the get-go, that I was going to have to do things with ritual. Actually, the very first ritual that we did was with Michael. Michael, as I mentioned, knows a lot about ritual, and I absolutely needed help. I couldn't hold my own ritual in the same way. I needed to be held in ritual. But the very first thing we did was a ritual to this was I invited all the friends of the close in friends and family to my home. And it was by invitation, but I knew that that what needed to happen was we needed to be able to feel whatever we were feeling, and people were feeling everything. It was so shocking, not just to me and his immediate siblings, family, but to everyone. We were well known in our community, well known in Seattle, and he was well known in his store. And the David who we knew and the David who could do this were not in the same bucket, so to speak. So it was just devastating for so many people. But the very close friends, it felt important to come and be able to be congruent. And just as an example, one of the very first things I did um, at the beginning of the ritual, one of my dear close friends who was there with me at the beginning when we found David, and who practices shamanic
Is that
traditions.
Antonia? Is that
Yes,
Antonia?
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
She was rattling, doing this amazing high rattling in front of the fireplace, and the whole, you could just feel the space if you've ever heard that kind of sound in a ritual. And when it got to a certain peak, I had an antique Chinese bowl, actually, a very valuable bowl that David was a collector of many different antiques, and this was from China, had a slight chip in it. And when we got to a certain point of the pitch of this rattling, I took the vessel and I just smashed it on the hearth.
Mm.
And the whole room, everyone, all of us just were, it's like it communicated to me, and I think to everyone, that we're not putting this back together in this death and the way that David left. And ultimately I would soon discover, the what he left me to, what came down on top of me that he couldn't handle, was not going to, this world was not going to go back together. And that was hugely powerful for me. As hard as it was also, again, getting congruence between what you know with your mind, conscious mind, and what your body knows. And then in the ritual, people had the opportunity, if they were moved to come up and share anything, whether it was anger, and it was sometimes for some people, or grief, or just scream, or whatever was correct for them. And the rest of us would just hold space for that. And this is a tradition that's used in many, that actually comes from someone named Joanna Macy, who does this work, has done this work brilliantly for years. And then after they would share, they would take a cedar bough, and put it on the fire and just send a little blessing to David's spirit as he transitioned for release in some way. It was actually I'll just say for myself, but I do feel there were certain things I could do that helped me, but also I knew would help the collective field find harmony
Mhm.
again, because it was such a shattering at so many levels for so many people.
The part that you guys did some of this grieving in community is
Hmm.
very cathartic, right? And it's because even though you all feel maybe different, the emotions that might be coming up for everybody are different around the grief. The fact that you're all holding space for each other in that grief in this community just is so, yeah, cathartic. It's
Absolutely, it was. Yeah.
the word I could use. Whoa,
Was
thunder.
that thunder and
Could you
lightning?
hear
Yeah,
it?
I did
Yeah,
hear it.
that was
Yes.
thunder.
Wow.
That was like the shattering of your. That was
Absolutely. That's an underlining of
wow.
what we're saying here. Yeah.
So I want to now go into how you were feeling and your travels to Hawaii. And a friend of yours offered a space for you to stay in Hawaii. You had so many responsibilities and things you had to kind of deal with,
Right.
again, of what you were left. You go to Hawaii with Antonia, and if you can share a little bit about your walking in the trails up. I've been to the volcano, and yet I can
Haleakala,
never pronounce
Haleakala.
it.
Yeah.
Haleakala. My kids could pronounce all of the words, everything when we were in Maui, my kids could say, yet I was like, I could never pronounce Haleakala. I could never retain it. So you're up in the trails and you have your own um spiritual experience in these trails. Could you
Well,
share
yeah.
a little bit
Hmm.
there?
I, it was important, and this is important for people going through the grieving journey. Is you have to. There were, in my case, things I had to take care of. I did not have the luxury, I could say, of just taking care of myself, and you know, I had to recognize the financial meltdown that was happening all around. There were just many, many things I had to do. But at a certain point, I knew I had done the first pass of all of that, and we had a lot of help to do that. And I knew I needed an exhale. I couldn't do it there in the, you could say, in the trauma zone of my home and my island and so on. So it's really important to know when it's right to go and be in a healing time. And the
So I'm going to
yeah.
pause you there. It's also that aspect of sometimes you have to step away to get to be able to see. I always say, like, you can't see your nose. You're so close to you can't see it, right? So it's that when you're so close into the situation, you can't see things sometimes in perspective. It's okay to take
Absolutely.
a few steps back to be able to really, yeah, see the view.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
you have to
Go ahead.
do that in your own, and I think everyone finds their own timing with that, because sometimes people want you to do it sooner than you're ready, but sometimes you wait too long too. You don't make that move. This is the title of my book, You Make Your Path by Walking. It's like the movement is really, really important. Literally the movement. Now, that doesn't mean you're always moving, but it means you're on a journey that is unfolding and you need to be tuning to what's the right next step for me. Anyway, for me, I was offered this beautiful opportunity to stay in a home in Maui, and I knew I couldn't do that on my own. So Antonia came with me, and she was the perfect partner. Well, we went into the Haleakala is a crater, a volcanic crater, and it's quite high, actually. So you hike down in it, and we just were hiking down, and it's raw. It's the clouds come in and out, so there's a sort of mist at times. There's shrubs, there's cactus. It's just raw, and it was the first time I felt like the outer world reflected my inner world. That's how I felt. And Antonia was way ahead, or she was somewhere. We were on our own. And I screamed and I sobbed and there was nobody around. I just felt like this is a match for what I feel. And I can have everything I feel, the whole range of the enormous grief, the enormous anger that David had left in the way that he had and at the time that he had. And the terror, as I said, of what is going to happen to me, to how do I get through this, all of that. Just give myself permission to have every feeling. So cathartic. That was cathartic. And interestingly, when you go, we'd gone down quite far, and it hadn't occurred to us that, I don't know if you recall this, but it happens to a lot of people. So the moment you turn and start to go back up, you realize it's because of the altitude, how hard it is. I mean, literally, you can barely take a step to get back up. And along the way, it was so symbolic because it was like every step was so hard, like we had cement
Mm.
boots on, and we passed a woman who had basically said, "I can't go back up." But this was getting to the end of the day. You had to get up out of there because at night it got freezing in there, and we ended up really getting her out of there. And for me, it was just saying, "You've got to take another step. Take another step. You can do this. You can do this." And I thought, especially later, it was just such a metaphor for me, for myself, for how the step I took could inspire somebody else. It
Mhm.
was all of those things. Yeah,
Yeah, I actually wrote down a quote that of what you said there, which was, "When everything falls apart, there is only what is directly in front of you. And that one step is what you need to take, and it's enough."
right. Yeah,
Because it's true. Sometimes we focus on the whole mountain ahead, right here, even as you're there
right.
in this, yet all you can focus on is just on that next step. And in your grief, that's what you that's what you did. And that experience of Hawaii, then you had another beautiful
Oh,
moment in the ocean, which then again showed you a whole other aspect of emotions that you had not experienced yet in your grief. Can you share the experience with the dolphins?
well, yes, and I had always wanted to swim with the dolphins, actually. I'd been to Hawaii before and had wanted to. There are people that you can't do this anymore. I think they've stopped this, but you used to be able to hire people that would know how to take you out to swim with dolphins, but it had never happened. And this was the day after the fire and heat of Haleakala, and Antonia and I went to the beach, and we could see far out. There were people on their wakeboard, on their surfboards and paddleboards, and that there was obviously a school of dolphins, but it was quite far out, and you would need to have something to get out there. But that was wonderful. We thought, oh, they're here. They're actually in this cove. That's so incredible. And so we both went under the water and did our own calling of the dolphins, however that would be, just sort of sending them our little blessing or our energy, let's say. And we were quite far apart where we were swimming. And all of a sudden, I could see these dorsal fins coming toward me, like 15 of them, 20 of them, a lot of them. And I was, that can't be the dolphins. And the dolphins went all the way around me several times. They made several turns. It was phenomenal experience of energy. First of all, I could almost touch them. Like I sort of have the sense that I touched them, but I don't know that I actually did touch them. But I was surrounded by them, and it was the water was all stirred up. But what I'd experienced, because there was a sort of fear initially when I saw all the fins coming toward me, that they're powerful animals. But then once they were around me, it was just this transmission of joy and love and joy. That's all I could say. It's just like just it just got injected into the cells of my being, and I can still feel it. I'm telling you about it. I can feel it, get the chills just remembering that feeling. And then they left, and then I was just sort of stunned and started swimming into shore. And Antonia was further over, and she started swimming. And well, they'd also done the same to her, which I hadn't known. And we got in, and people on the beach said, "Oh my God, what was that like? We just saw the dolphins swimming around you guys." It was just amazing. And I will
So beautiful.
say, it sort of like they awakened the joy and love in my heart that I would come to experience long time later, because it didn't last for long. But I felt it was possible, and I felt it. All of a sudden, all of those endorphins, oxytocin, everything just flooded my system that had not been present. It was so healing for me.
It's so important to be able to recall these different little moments in which we have in our life, because they do give us then that hope that those feelings of love, of joy will be possible. Even amidst your grief, you still had these glimpses of
Yeah.
joy, love, and they give you hope and for what can be.
Well, I'm
So
just going
thank
to
you for
add, if I
sharing
may,
that.
if I can just
Please,
add kind of
please
I
add
think
as much.
they give you hope, but also later there would be many things that would happen where there'd just be a moment of joy with somebody, or we'd be having a glass of wine and telling a funny story, or something, joy, sweetness, love, that were just
Mm,
so in contrast to the normal moments of my day. And I think of emotions basically as being waves. They are meant to be waves. They rise and they fall. Unfortunately, sometimes, especially the unpleasant ones, we attach to them, and
yes.
we hold on to them, and they don't get the chance to resolve, or we identify with them. But when I would have I'd be sort of basically up out of the underworld, in a moment of joy, I would soak it all up. Like, this is something to really be deliberate
Mm,
about, any of your listeners. That first of all, you have to accept that there will be those moments, and that doesn't mean it's a denying of the horror and the loss and the connection with your beloved and your love, that you would feel joy again. You actually need it. And when you do, whenever there's one of those moments, just like, you just literally turn the volume up, let yourself get flooded with that feeling, because you'll need it, because it's like oxygen, right? And then you're going to get pulled down again into by the undertow of grief, and you'll
mm,
be down deep, and your body will literally need that um, cellular connection to joy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like coming out. It's just like the dolphins coming out for air. They go back, they
That's
come
right.
out, right? They come back down. So those moments in which you are feeling that joy, it's like feeling that sun, that warmth in your body to kind of recharge you for those moments in which you're
Hmm.
going to be down again in these other experiences and emotions of sorrow and sadness and grief, and just to know that it's just
Hmm.
going to be a waves. As we're kind of wrapping up the conversation, I could go deeper. I could go into I wrote notes of wanting to also talk about your cat Emma and that aspect there, but I want the readers to go and read that, the listeners to go and read that as well. So as we're wrapping up, please share with us, one is how, when your book comes out. It comes out in June
June
when?
13th.
June 13th. And how can people get your book?
It's everywhere right now. It's on Amazon and Bookshop, and
So
your local.
pre-ordering
You're, yeah, pre-ordering, yes, and also I highly support your local bookstore. So go in and pre-order it with them, and you can get a link. All those links on my website too.
as well. And now, aside from your book, can you please share how people can be in touch with you and work with
Yeah.
you, and what kind of women do you particularly work with? Women still
I
with women?
do, although this book
Okay.
will see in the future, I'll be doing programs that are probably mixed gender in that way. But I am running a retreat for the first time in 10 years, actually. That's a retreat outside of my programs that I run, 15-month programs for women that are very, very powerful experiences of transformation. They have retreats, but a retreat just for people to come to for the first time, that'll be June 8th to the 11th, right before my book comes out. That's on the website. You Make Your Path by Walking retreat. And there's also going to be a webinar book launch online on June 22nd. That's also on the retreat. And women can sign up for that. That'll be a 90-minute sort of workshop on the core principles of how you live your life by making your path by walking. And get on my mailing list. My website is mysterialwoman.com, and that's MYSTERIAL woman.com. And be in touch that way.
So many offerings that you have for the listeners. Now, Suzanne, if you can share with us any other parting thoughts regarding the grief journey or hope for the person and people that are listening to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I think the the point of my book, the reason I actually wrote the book, I didn't know that I would write this book. I needed to write for myself at a certain point. And then it became clear after I'd written that this might be of value to others. But the main essence is that if you are going through something, life has happened, dragged you into Hades, you could say, by a loss that you are grieving, then you have loved some. You have had a lot of, there's this beautiful connection between loving and losing. And so that love is available. And it's also, that's the breaking open of your heart. And it's possible, and this is my lived experience, that you can, how you live through the the journey of loss is what determines where you go next, as opposed to, I'm just trying to get back to some normal, just trying to get back to where I was before, just trying to have my life again. But no, actually, there's a becoming. There's somewhere new you can be taken. Um, I'm I have found that I am still unfolding that journey, and it is possible that your journey can take you somewhere that you could never have imagined. Now that is different, and I need to distinguish that from, oh, this was meant to happen, or what a gift it was, or I don't actually.
Subscribe to that.
No,
Subscribe to that.
I can relate to the offerings that I
Mhm.
took in and metabolized during this. I wouldn't necessarily call them gifts. They were brutal and very, very hard, but they were the offerings. They were what was. For me, I lost absolutely everything. Not everybody will have to go through that. But I did take it in as, okay, I am reduced to the ashes here, and how will I rebuild myself and my life? And that is up to me.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking back to the entrepreneur women that you worked with in Toronto, and how they wanted to move forward, yet at the same time weren't. Like when you were coaching, you're like, wait, what's going on here? And this aspect of change being something that is so hard for so many of us, right? But that knowing that it's okay to change. And sometimes we do get comfortable in what we know and what we think is, and that this is a reality, that we cannot fathom it being or looking any different until things like what occurred to you happen,
Yeah,
that you're brought down to again to start from scratch and rebuild. And this happens in different aspects of life, not just in these situations like yours, but in other circumstances,
for
people
sure.
losing their jobs and things like that, and what you do from there. And again, with even just the title of your book being, it's like you make your path by walking. And that's a thing. It's like you do have to take that first step into a direction, and you will
Yeah,
see what the path holds from there.
absolutely. And change is, we're still, all of us, emerging out of the pandemic situation and the enormous cost that had, and the trauma that was, actually. Some of us losing people directly through that, or certainly losing a way of life, and we're just coming back into that. So I in my work have a slogan that says basically, welcome discomfort, because
Mm.
the changes, the discomforts in our life have the potential to be the things that are allowing us to grow again. But we have to see that and not resist it, not think, oh, because this is different than it was before, this shouldn't be happening, or I want to just get comfortable again, and really let ourselves be in the mystery of life unfolding. Like our becoming is such an incredible mystery, and we have the opportunity to be, through those of us that are given the offering of a very difficult loss, then I felt there's an honoring also of that love you had for that person that you lost, in the way that you choose to grow yourself, become more whole through the losing. It's a very, very powerful process.
I'm taking it all in, everything you said. I am grateful for you having shared your journey and your story and little glimpses of your life here with the audience. And I wish you all the best in the release of this book in June and of this retreat. And I hope the listeners are able to connect with you and maybe join you in that, or the online launch. So thank you so much again, Suzanne.
Thank
This was
you.
Suzanne Anderson for us on the podcast. And again, the book is titled You Make Your Path by Walking. Thank you again, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.